The restaurant was packed, but the manager's shout echoed above everything. "You don't belong here," he yelled, pointing at the frightened immigrant. Customers stopped eating, forks suspended, eyes wide in shock and disbelief. The immigrant, head bowed, clutched a dirty apron, hands trembling uncontrollably. Morgan Freeman, seated in a quiet corner, lifted his eyes from the menu. He hadn't spoken yet, but his gaze already carried an unmistakable weight. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone knew something was about to change. Manager Face Red continued, voice dripping with contempt and anger. "I know where you came from, and this isn't the place for you." The immigrant tried to speak, but his voice faltered, choked by fear. Customers murmured among themselves, some uncomfortable, others far too curious. Morgan Freeman leaned forward, his expression calm but firm as stone. "I disagree," he said, deep voice echoing like distant thunder. The manager turned, surprised, and the entire restaurant held its breath. "Who are you to disagree?" retorted the manager, eyes narrow, challenging. He didn't recognize Morgan Freeman, blinded by his own arrogance and fury. "Just another customer with no business here," he continued, dismissive. Morgan Freeman stood slowly, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. "You're wrong," he said, voice carrying an unquestionable authority. Customers began filming with their phones, sensing the tension rise. The immigrant, still head down, seemed small, but his eyes glimmered. "I've seen men like you before," said Morgan Freeman, approaching calmly. "Men who think they can decide who belongs and who doesn't belong." The manager laughed, a harsh sound, but his eyes betrayed slight discomfort. "You know nothing about me," he retorted, trying to maintain control. Morgan Freeman stopped a few steps away, gaze fixed as if seeing his soul. "I know enough," he said, and the silence in the restaurant intensified. No one dared blink, and the immigrant lifted his eyes, hopeful for the first time. The manager tried to shift tactics, pointing at the immigrant with disdain. "He has no papers. No right to be here, working illegally." Morgan Freeman tilted his head as if weighing each word carefully. "Papers don't define a man's worth," he said, voice resolute. "But your actions do," he continued, and the manager hesitated, visibly shaken. Customers began murmuring again, some clapping timidly in support. The immigrant, now looking directly at Morgan Freeman, seemed to find strength. "You think you're a hero?" asked the manager, voice trembling with anger. Morgan Freeman smiled slightly, a smile not of victory, but of wisdom. "I'm not a hero," he said, "but I recognize a mistake when I see one." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Phones kept filming, and the video was already going viral online. Morgan Freeman turned to the immigrant, and their eyes met. What the immigrant said next would change everything, but no one expected it. "I know you," said the immigrant, voice shaky but filled with emotion. Morgan Freeman blinked, surprised, while the entire restaurant listened in silence. "I heard your voice in movies when I was trapped in my country. Your voice gave me hope, made me believe I could be more." The manager scoffed, clearly annoyed, but no one paid attention to him now. Morgan Freeman tilted his head, listening intently, as if every word mattered. Customers, still filming, began whispering, "This is going to explode online." "I fled from war," continued the immigrant, eyes teary but resolute. "I arrived here with nothing, but your voice reminded me I had worth." Morgan Freeman stayed silent, processing the words, visibly moved. The manager tried to interrupt. "This doesn't change anything," but was ignored. "You helped me without knowing," said the immigrant, pointing to his heart. Morgan Freeman took a deep breath, and for the first time, his calm seemed shaken. Customers began clapping, but the manager wasn't ready to give up. "Enough of this sentimental nonsense," shouted the manager, face red with fury. "He has no right to be here, and I'll call the police." Morgan Freeman turned to him, eyes narrow, a rare intensity in his gaze. "The police won't fix what you started here," he said, voice deep. The manager hesitated, feeling the weight of Morgan Freeman's presence for the first time. Phones kept filming, and the video was already trending on Twitter. But the immigrant, now more confident, had more to say. "I'm a chef," said the immigrant, voice firm, looking at the manager. "I cooked for my family, my community before the war. I came here to work, to build a life, not to be humiliated." Morgan Freeman looked at him, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "A chef, huh?" asked Morgan Freeman, and the immigrant nodded, proud. The manager laughed. "A chef? You're nothing but a janitor here." But Morgan Freeman knew this story was far from over. "I lost my job because of people like him," said the manager finally. "Immigrants like him take opportunities from citizens, from honest workers." Morgan Freeman tilted his head, as if understanding but not agreeing. "You blame him for what happened to you," he said, voice calm. "But maybe you should look at yourself before pointing the finger." The manager fell silent, and customers began debating among themselves. The tension in the restaurant was at its peak, and no one knew what would come. Morgan Freeman turned to the immigrant, ignoring the manager for a moment. "You said you're a chef," he repeated. "So tell me, what's your specialty?" The immigrant hesitated, surprised by the question, but answered with pride. "I make a stew my mother taught me, with spices from my country." Morgan Freeman smiled. A genuine smile, and the restaurant felt lighter. "I'd like to taste that someday," he said, and the manager froze. What Morgan Freeman did next left everyone speechless. Morgan Freeman turned to the manager, gaze firm, almost challenging. "You say he doesn't belong here," he said, voice echoing in the silence. "But I say he has more value than you imagine." The manager laughed, but the sound was weak, almost forced, visibly uncomfortable. "Value? He's a janitor, not a chef," he retorted, trying to regain control. Morgan Freeman tilted his head, and a murmur ran through the restaurant. "Then let's test that," he said, and everyone held their breath. "I challenge you," continued Morgan Freeman, pointing at the manager. "Let him cook something here now for all of us to judge." The manager blinked, surprised, clearly not expecting this twist. "That's ridiculous," he shouted, but customers began clapping in support. "I want to see that," shouted someone, and others echoed, phones still filming. The immigrant looked at Morgan Freeman, eyes filled with gratitude and determination. Morgan Freeman nodded to him, a simple but powerful gesture. "You can't be serious," said the manager, voice trembling with anger. "I am," responded Morgan Freeman, and his voice was like a final sentence. The immigrant hesitated, but Morgan Freeman placed a hand on his shoulder. "You said you're a chef," he said, "so show them." The immigrant took a deep breath and for the first time seemed confident. Customers began shouting, "Let him cook," and the manager was cornered. The pressure was at its peak, and the video was already on millions of screens. The manager tried to protest, but customers were no longer on his side. "I won't allow this," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out. Morgan Freeman looked at the restaurant owner, who watched in silence. "You're the owner, aren't you?" asked Morgan Freeman, and the man nodded. "Then give him a chance," he said, and the owner hesitated. "A chance to prove what he's worth," continued Morgan Freeman. The owner finally nodded, and the manager was speechless, furious. The immigrant was led to the kitchen, still trembling but determined. Morgan Freeman followed him with his eyes, as if knowing what would come. Customers began organizing, forming an impromptu audience. "I'll prove he's a fraud," said the manager, following to the kitchen. But Morgan Freeman just smiled, a smile that said more than words. The immigrant began cooking, and the smell started spreading. No one knew what to expect, but everyone felt something big was happening. The manager tried to interfere, shouting orders, but the immigrant ignored him. He chopped, mixed, cooked with a precision that surprised everyone. Morgan Freeman stood at the kitchen door, watching, arms crossed, calm. Customers began commenting, "This smells amazing," and the manager looked nervous. The immigrant finished the dish, a steaming stew, and looked at Morgan Freeman. "It's ready," he said, and Morgan Freeman nodded, eyes gleaming. What happened when the dish was served would change everyone's fate. The immigrant brought the dish to the hall, hands steady, but heart racing. The stew steamed, the aroma filling the restaurant, silencing even the skeptics. Morgan Freeman was the first to approach, picking up a fork calmly. He tasted, closed his eyes, and a slow smile formed on his face. "You didn't cook this," said the manager, but his voice trembled with uncertainty. Morgan Freeman opened his eyes, looking directly at him. "You're wrong again." Customers began approaching, eager to taste, and the manager froze. "I want to taste," said a woman, and others echoed, forming a line. The immigrant served each one, eyes shining with a mix of fear and pride. Customers tasted, and murmurs of surprise began to grow. "This is incredible," shouted a man, and others nodded, impressed. Freeman looked at the immigrant. "You have a gift," he said. The manager tried to laugh. "This proves nothing." But no one listened. The video kept circulating, and the restaurant was in an uproar. The restaurant owner approached, tasted the dish, and his eyes widened. "I've never tasted anything like this," he said, looking at the immigrant. "You cooked this here with our ingredients?" he asked, incredulous. The immigrant nodded. "Yes, sir, it's what I know how to do." The manager tried to intervene. "This changes nothing," but the owner interrupted. "You're wrong," said the owner, and the manager fell silent, defeated. Morgan Freeman smiled, knowing the game had changed. "I want to hire you," said the owner, looking at the immigrant. The immigrant blinked, surprised, and customers began clapping, emotional. "You can start tomorrow," continued the owner, and the immigrant nodded, tears in eyes. Morgan Freeman looked at him. "You proved your worth, not just to them." The manager tried to protest. "This is a mistake," but no one listened. Customers kept filming, and the video was already on millions of screens. But the manager had one last trick up his sleeve, and no one expected it. "I'll report you," shouted the manager, pointing at the immigrant. "You're here illegally, and I'll make sure you're deported." "You can't fire me," shouted the manager, face red, almost unhinged. "I gave years to this place," he continued, but the owner remained firm. "You shamed this place," said the owner, and customers nodded in agreement. Morgan Freeman looked at the immigrant. "You're safe now," he said. The immigrant nodded, tears falling, but a smile starting to form. The manager stormed out, furious. But no one knew what he'd do next. The video kept going viral, and the immigrant's fate was still at stake. The restaurant buzzed with energy, but the air still crackled with tension. Morgan Freeman stood by the immigrant, his presence a shield against doubt. The fired manager stormed out, but his parting glare lingered like a threat. "I'll make sure you regret this," he muttered, slamming the door behind him. The immigrant looked at Morgan Freeman, fear flickering in his eyes again. "Don't worry," said Morgan Freeman, voice steady. "You've already won today." But the customers, still filming, sensed the story wasn't over yet. The immigrant wiped his tears, clutching the apron now stained with hope. "I never thought I'd cook again," he said, voice trembling but proud. Morgan Freeman nodded. "You didn't just cook, you told a story with your dish." The owner approached, shaking the immigrant's hand. "You're part of us now." Customers cheered, some posting comments online. "This is the best story ever." But outside, the manager paced, phone in hand, plotting his revenge. The video, now viral, had millions watching, but danger loomed closer. Hours later, the restaurant quieted and Morgan Freeman prepared to leave. "You changed my life," said the immigrant, eyes shining with gratitude. Morgan Freeman smiled. "You changed it yourself. I just gave you a stage." They shook hands, a moment captured by a lingering customer's camera. "Keep cooking," said Morgan Freeman, "and keep telling your story." The immigrant nodded, but as Morgan Freeman stepped outside, trouble arrived. Police lights flashed, and the manager stood smirking by the squad car. "He's illegal," shouted the manager, pointing at the restaurant door. The police officers approached, faces stern, radios crackling with static. Morgan Freeman turned, his calm demeanor unshaken, and walked back inside. "Officers," he said, voice resonating, "this man just proved his worth here." The manager laughed. "Worth? He's a criminal, and I'll prove it." Customers began streaming the encounter live, and the tension escalated fast. Morgan Freeman looked at the immigrant, and their eyes locked in determination. "I called immigration," said the manager, smug. "He'll be gone by morning." The immigrant's face fell, but Morgan Freeman placed a hand on his shoulder. You can't deport a man for cooking a meal, said Morgan Freeman, firm. The officers hesitated, one whispering, "That's Morgan Freeman, isn't it?" The owner stepped forward. "He's my employee now, and I'll vouch for him." The manager's smirk faded, and the crowd began chanting, "Let him stay." The police exchanged glances, and the manager's plan started crumbling. "We'll need to verify his status," said an officer, but his tone softened. Morgan Freeman looked at the manager. "You've lost more than a job tonight." The manager's face twisted in anger, but he had no allies left. The immigrant turned to Morgan Freeman. "Thank you for everything." Morgan Freeman nodded. "The world saw you tonight, and they won't forget." The video ended with cheers, but the immigrant's journey was just beginning. As Morgan Freeman walked away, the restaurant glowed with newfound hope.